Welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining us today because we're looking at something truly fascinating, the psychology of sea monsters. For centuries, people looked out at the vast, totally uncharted ocean and just populated it with these nightmarish creatures. But what if I told you those ancient legends weren't just random ghost stories? What if they were actually brilliant, kind of terrifying psychological manifestations of very real oceanic fears? Today we're going to decode the minds of ancient sailors and explore the true monsters that haunted the deep.
So, what is the most dangerous weapon a sea monster can possess? If you asked anyone what makes a sea beast terrifying, they'd probably point to, razor-sharp teeth, massive claws, or maybe immense speed. But as we comb through ancient texts and folklore, a completely different picture emerges. We're going to challenge that notion right out of the gate. The absolute most dangerous weapon in the ancient ocean wasn't a claw, and it wasn't a tooth. It was deception. The monsters that truly kept sailors awake at night were the ones that messed with their minds before ever touching their bodies.
Let's dive right into our first psychological theme, the unseen stalkers. There is this very specific, deep-seated terror that comes from what you literally cannot see. When you're out on the open ocean, the surface might look perfectly normal, perfectly safe, but right beneath your feet, there are miles and miles of deep, dark water. Ancient folklore tapped heavily into this unpredictable, hidden nature of the sea, creating monsters that basically weaponized the unknown.
To really get this, we're looking at Japanese folklore, specifically a creature known as the Isonade, which was a gigantic Japanese sea creature recognized only by sudden fierce winds and a massive barbed tail. What's absolutely brilliant and terrifying is how perfectly this myth captures the horror of isolation. The Isonade was described as this gigantic, shark-like monster. But the kicker? Nobody actually saw it coming. It didn't have some dramatic Hollywood reveal where it breached the surface. No, its massive body stayed completely hidden beneath the waves. The only warning signs you got were sudden, fierce winds whipping across the water, and then bam, the sudden emergence of this enormous tail covered in countless sharp hooks and barbs.
We're looking at the calm surface versus the danger below. Just imagine you're a fisherman. One minute you're sitting on a perfectly glass-like sea, just going about your day. The next second, the weather shifts, a powerful gust hits, and out of absolutely nowhere, this gigantic barbed tail breaks the surface. The Isonade used that tail like a giant wrecking ball to snag people and entire boats, dragging them straight down into the unseen depths. The real terror here is the chilling realization that a calm surface means absolutely nothing when something that massive is already racing towards you from below.
Now, this fear of the hidden wasn't just in Japan. It was shared by sailors crossing the North Atlantic, who brought back legends of a wildly bizarre creature known as the Zifus. Let's run through the Zifus profile real quick. A dark, scaly body, a massive dorsal fin, and a long beak-like snout. Unlike anything found in the known seas, right? This thing looked completely alien compared to the whales or sharks sailors were used to. Honestly, it looked less like a normal animal and way more like something that just crawled up from the very bottom of the world.
But using unpredictability as a weapon was its real trick. The crucial point wasn't just how freaky it looked, it was how it acted. The Zifus was notoriously aggressive. Instead of swimming away from ships like a normal creature, it would actively approach them, slowly circling through the water like it was studying the crew. And because it kept most of its dark body submerged, sailors literally couldn't tell if they were looking at the whole animal or just the tip of something impossibly massive. It would duck beneath the vessel, leaving everyone in a state of absolute panic, only to pop up on the complete opposite side, or just vanish entirely. That agonizing, heart-pounding uncertainty, that was a weapon all on its own.
As we continue our psychological deep dive, let's shift gears a bit to the false sanctuary. If the first fear was about what you couldn't see, this second one is arguably worse. It's the cruelest trick the ocean can play on what you actually can see. I mean, imagine the sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of being at sea for weeks. All you want, all you can think about, is the safety of solid ground. Spotting land after days of nothing but open water is a moment of pure, unadulterated relief. But folklore took that exact moment of hope and twisted it into a literal trap.
So what if that island isn't land? Put yourself right in the shoes of that exhausted ancient sailor for a second. You're squinting at a dark shape on the horizon. The sight brings this huge wave of immediate relief. Your ship edges closer and closer. But what if that island isn't actually land at all?
Everything appears exactly as you'd expect. It isn't moving, it isn't drifting, it sits safely in the middle of the sea. You let out a massive sigh of relief.
You prepare to drop anchor and make landfall. But then, slowly at first, the very ground beneath your feet starts to shift. The incredibly creepy medieval legend of the Aspidochelone was born from this exact terrifying nightmare. We can completely shatter that false sense of calm right now by looking at a safe haven versus the Aspidochelone. On one hand, you have the welcoming, solid sanctuary of an island. On the other, the horrifying reality of the Aspidochelone. Some texts called it a colossal whale, others said it was a massive turtle-like monster. But the legend always agreed on one brutal detail. Sailors would drop their anchor directly onto the creature's back, totally convinced they had finally found safety. And the very second they settled in, the creature would wake up and violently plunge into the ocean, dragging the ship, the crew, the whole shebang, straight down into the black depths.
Its greatest weapon wasn't claws, teeth, or supernatural powers. It was its sheer, deceptive size. And honestly, this brilliantly highlights the psychological genius of this specific myth. The monster didn't need to breathe fire or have giant claws. The human mind simply couldn't compute a living creature so unbelievably huge that it looked exactly like an island. Its ultimate weapon was just a glitch in our own brains, the fact that we refused to recognize it as a threat until it was way, way too late.
All right, let's pack our bags and head to the freezing, punishing waters of Norse legends to look at the living traps. While some monsters aggressively chase down ships or ambush them with sheer brute force, Norse folklore introduced a totally different kind of sea monster, one that relied on something much more sinister: immense, highly calculated biological patience.
Meet the Hafgufa. This was one of the largest Norse sea monsters, and it hunted by floating motionless with an enormous open mouth. This thing was considered one of the biggest creatures to ever supposedly inhabit the ocean. But here's the catch. The Hafgufa didn't waste its energy hunting sailors down. Actually, scratch that, it did something worse. It exploited a sailor's good luck. Out on the water, spotting thousands of fish suddenly gathering in one spot, that's a dream come true. It means plenty of food, huge profit, and an easy trip home. The Hafgufa totally knew this. It just floated absolutely motionless near the surface with its massive jaws wide open, turning a seemingly lucky gathering of fish into a deadly, inescapable maritime trap. Let's walk through the Hafgufa's strategy, because what's crazy here is how methodical and almost scientific it was. Step 1, the creature floats right near the surface. Step 2, it releases some kind of food or bait into the water. Step 3, it literally just waits. More and more fish show up, crowding into the area for what they think is an easy meal. And finally, step 4, when the prey is at its absolute peak density, those massive jaws just snap shut, swallowing everything in one gulp. And yeah, that often included the poor sailors who were foolishly trying to cast their nets into the feeding frenzy. Now for the Hafgufa legend versus real whale behavior. Here is a totally fascinating twist that grounds this massive, scary mythology right in reality. When historians and biologists compare the legend of the Hafgufa to actual documented whale behavior today, it turns out this terrifying monster was almost certainly inspired by real whales. No joke. Certain whale species have been observed trap feeding, which is literally just sitting near the surface with their mouths wide open, letting fish naturally gather before suddenly swallowing them all at once. Over centuries of oral tradition, basically playing a giant game of telephone, observing a real animal do this evolved into the legend of a colossal ship-eating monster.
So, the psychological lure. The crucial takeaway here is that a lot of these stories stem from a simple misunderstanding of nature. But our final theme today takes a much darker turn. We're heading over to old Scottish folklore, where the horror brilliantly shifts away from brute size or physical traps. Here, we encounter straight-up intelligent psychological manipulation. This isn't just a hungry animal looking for a meal. This is something much, much more calculated.
These beings were known as the Finnfolk. Let's check out their profile. They supposedly lived in a hidden underwater kingdom called Finnfolk. They were total masters of sea magic, and most importantly, they had deadly shape-shifting abilities. They were powerful, super intelligent beings who could supposedly control storms and travel at just impossible speeds. But their deadliest asset by far was that shape-shifting. They didn't need physical strength because they were masters of magical deception. A Finnfolk could take the form of an ordinary person or maybe a beautiful woman calling out for help from a distant rock surrounded by the sea.
And the result? The distance never closes. Just imagine the chilling psychological torture of this scenario. A curious sailor spots this figure on a rock and steers his boat towards them to help out, or even just to investigate. The figure always seems just close enough to reach. You know the feeling? But as the sailor rows, the distance never seems to actually close. Slowly, completely without realizing it, they are pursuing a literal illusion across the water, drifting farther and farther away from the safety of the shore. They don't realize they're being actively hunted until it is entirely too late.
Vanished into Finnfolk, never to be seen again. That brings us to the grim conclusion of these encounters. These sailors didn't just drown in a random storm, they vanished into Finnfolk. Their disappearances weren't chalked up to bad weather or poor navigation. They became a core part of the enduring magical mystery of the deep. They were taken, completely tricked by their own minds and senses, and just erased from the world above.
If ancient sailors mistook real whales for monsters, what else out there is still waiting to be misunderstood? Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought. We've seen how the very real fear of the unseen created the Isonade, how the desperate desire for safety birthed the Aspidochelone, and how actual whale behavior was completely exaggerated into the mighty Hafgufa. So I'll leave you with this. The ocean is unimaginably vast, and a huge percentage of it remains completely unexplored even today. If ancient sailors mistook the natural feeding habits of real whales for world-ending monsters, what else is lurking out there in the dark, just waiting to be misunderstood? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this changes how you look at the deep blue sea next time you're at the beach.